again, here in the 12th century, we're in, we're in pre-Reformation England. So the church is the Pope's church. He is the head of all religious life in England. So if you're Catholic, you'll know basically like the Pope who are basically these electors and advisors who don't really have that much direct authority to manage things. They're more ceremonial. And so really, just make sure if you have background noise that you mute, please. That would be helpful. So really the most, like the second powerful person underneath the Pope is like an archbishop. And if you look at even nowadays in the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury is like the most powerful religious figure besides the monarch. The monarch is considered the head of the church as well. And you all know like the history of like Henry VIII and how that happened, but underneath the monarch. So right now the monarch isn't the head of the church, but the head of the church within England is the Archbishop, and specifically the Archbishop of Canterbury. The two main ones are Canterbury and York. And basically their domain of responsibility is this really weird word called diocese, which basically designates like a specific territorial jurisdiction. So you can see that an archbishop is in charge of an archdiocese, and a bishop underneath an archbishop would be in charge of like a diocese, which is basically a large area of land. You could basically think of a bishop as a religious governor. And if you go to Wikipedia, you can like find lists of like bishops that have existed in English life, and they're always like funny English names like Bishop of Gloucestershire, Bishop of Exeter, and stuff like that. So that's like in this case, right? Like we met Bishop Walleran, and so like that's probably like from a religious perspective, like the bishop is the most powerful person. Like if you win the favor of a bishop, you're like as someone lower, you're probably in good standing. If you don't, then you're basically effed, because like who are you going to go to? Like your bishop is your main sponsor. Like if you're going to get elected as someone else in church life, like you need to be able to find the favor of that. So there's a tension we're going to see play out. What happens when your bishop doesn't like you, etc. So there's like a separate thing underneath the bishop, which hasn't really been mentioned, but I just thought I'd include it, which is that similarly to how like the cardinal is like someone who's is an elector of the Pope, but like advisor and does administration, there's a role called the canon, which is often elected or often selected by the bishop. And so if you're a bishop and you're in charge of a large like cathedral, or you know, you're with an earl who's a secular title, and you like run a castle or like a field of things, sometimes you'll have a college associated with your diocese, and so you might elect somebody who's in charge of running that collegiate community. Also, sometimes someone who's like a prior or a priest that has done exceptional service, maybe like honorary elevated to the role of canon. But basically the canon is kind of like a priest, but they have specific to like learning and academic duties and like discharge duties that are related to like running the diocese specifically. And so I just thought this was neat because it's kind of a reminder that if you think about most of like the Western college system actually comes out of religious life, which is easy to forget nowadays because college and university is a mess, quote unquote meritocracy. But there's this idea that in order to be university administrator, you actually do need to be designated by someone in the moral hierarchy to be the leader of the collegiate community. And so I don't think we meet like any canons. I think later you'll see, like, for example, Prior Philip wants to create his own library, and so in some sense he's already operating at that level, but he doesn't have that distinction. And then the next two are kind of tied. I tried to figure out like what the difference between an abbey and a priory is, and they seem very similar. What I found is that like if you're an abbey, like the prior is second in command to an abbot. And if you're in a priory, like the abbot is second in command. So they're kind of like parallel tracks, but I know from what I can find, the abbeys are sometimes larger in population and size. But essentially, that's the next level down is the prior. So if the bishop is the governor, then the prior is like the city councilor, or he's just in charge of like a priory, which is separate from like a main diocese or like a main like bishop territory. And priories, unless they're like truly exceptional, generally don't have colleges associated with them, right? They'll have churches, sometimes they'll have small cathedrals, but nothing that you in major cities. Yes, abbeys are simply much larger in size. Great, thanks, Sirius. I appreciate that. Underneath the prior, you have like priests who are in charge of a specific village parish, right? So sometimes you'll have like one or two priests in a priory that like span multiple villages, but usually it's like you have the main priest in the village and they do the services and things like that, whereas the prior is in charge of actually running the whole thing day to day, etc. Then you have two levels below that, which are monks. So if you remember, like Philip started out as a monk, and that's usually in like a wilderness monastery. So that's not like, monasteries are not in the middle of civilization like a priory or abbey. They're often self-sufficient. They have to take care of themselves. It's often a trek to the nearest village. And so the main difference between a monk and a friar is a monk stays within the monastery and helps run it with his brothers or sisters if they're a nunnery. Whereas a friar is involved in missions and public ministry. And so at some point, a monk might go out and take on missionaries or public ministry. And then as they travel across the country, they have to take donations and charity and things like that. So you can imagine, like, for example, if a priory is electing a new prior, right, you might have like some battles between monks and priests. Like a priest might argue that because they've been holding service for the village for so long, they should become the prior, whereas a monk might say, oh, well, I've been more steeped in religious life and self-sufficiency, and so I have more religious authority, etc. So I think this sort of shows that there's like a very complicated network of who has power, who administers like the land and like the food, and then who has more like ceremonial things, whether it's running a college or running some sort of other sort of venture that's like aside to the main religious institution. So we'll stop there if there's any questions or anyone's very confused.
I'll just say, as someone who's raised Protestant, this is really helpful. I had a sort of lay understanding of some of these hierarchies, but having it placed having it in one place and clearly demarcated helped me a lot, because it is quite confusing for someone like me. So appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes. Ditto. I would also just mention, I believe the structure of the Catholic Church is sort of the ghost of the late Roman Empire. I believe under Diocletian, they reorganized the empire, and the one of the main administrative units politically was the diocese. And I think in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire, the church just sort of, adopted the same kind of administrative divisions and repurposed it for religious reasons rather than daily life politics.
An interesting thing of that too is I believe Pope comes from Pontifex Maximus, which was a Roman, pagan position that I believe Augustus actually held for a bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was a clever move by the church to almost continue the Roman Empire. It's the way that the Catholics kind of hid away. It's quite interesting to listen to you guys talk about this, because obviously, being in the UK, this is pretty much like our history, and it lays around in the land and everywhere around us. There's just, after Henry VIII's time, the abbeys are just all desolate shells of old buildings, which are really cool places to go to, but there's lots of ghosts there. As a tangent, there's an excellent I mean, it was originally a book, and not adding another book into your reading lists, but there's an excellent, it was on BBC iPlayer. I don't know if that's available in the US, but Wolf Hall, which is the story of Thomas Cromwell, who was the prime minister underneath Henry VIII, goes through the Reformation, but also covers a lot of the different titles and different positions, which is quite useful to get your head around what the land was like at the time. And obviously that was 1400, something along those lines. So these power structures were all changing and adjusting. But the Archbishop at the time there was the lead influencer because he was connected to Rome. And then slowly, as the king wanted to change that, obviously for his own devices, that power, that soft power started to change. But it's quite a good exploration of kind of those topics.
Is
Yeah,
that
and
the
I'm gonna
Hilary
get-
Mantel novel? Sorry.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna give two examples because I think they're really funny, of like the king trying to wrest power away from the church, from the Vatican for his own powers. And I think we're gonna see some of that in the book too as we continue. It probably wasn't funny living through that, because if you live in a place where power is unstable, it's very scary. But looking back, it's kind of hilarious. So I'll quickly go through this. So this chart actually is actually more for like European royalty. So like I put down here like Count and Viscount really don't exist as English titles specifically. In England, they're usually called like earls and sheriffs. So like an earl will be in charge of an earldom. This is what William is. He's Earl of, well, depending on whose side you're on, he's Earl of Shiring. And there's a sheriff too that's usually associated with like underneath the earl, who like does more of the execution of like the law and things like this. And so we know what a king is. The prince is usually, I think it's interesting here. So these numbers aren't literal, but if you look at the side, like one per kingdom. So if you think of like Great Britain technically is 4 kingdoms, right? There's England, Scotland, Ireland, and oh my God, what's the fourth one?
Wales.
Wales.
Yeah. So technically, like Great Britain should have like 4 princes. And so like Prince Philip was, I think, Prince, I don't remember what prince he was of. And then Charles was Prince of Wales, correct? And so the idea is that obviously you have a prince by birth, but the idea is that they like are in charge of like a specific kingdom within the larger like specific civilization or within the larger thing.
That's interesting. Philip was the Duke of Edinburgh. Charles was obviously Prince of Wales, but I can't think of an Irish kind of connection there.
Oh yeah, England is, the conclusion is that England is weird. Like it doesn't follow.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I know.
So anything from like prince to like down to sheriff, like not really sheriff, really earl is what's considered a high noble. And then below that, below count is where you have like low nobles. And then underneath that, basically like knights aren't really considered, like you can get knighted by the crown, but you have to fund your own weaponry and things like that. And you're basically serving either a lord or like an earl. And so knights don't particularly have a lot of freedom, whereas someone like a lord or a baron would have more freedom, but still they would be subject to like secular law from like the earl. I point this out simply because I want to draw parallels, because you could see, for example, right, like both bishops have to administer lands, but so do earls, right, as well, and so do barons, right? And so to the degree that there's a lot of secular and religious conflict, it's because like the church isn't going to give up like its land on when it's building an abbey or like a cathedral, right? Or it's not, it wants to have its own land rights to be able to farm and extract other resources. And so like there's there's this like sort of namby-pamby like idea, oh, separation of church and state, and like Anglo society like pioneered this revolutionary idea, but it's like the separation actually leads to a lot of internecine conflict, because like the bishop is technically a governor, but he has no martial authority. So at the end of the day, all he can say is that, hey, Earl, you can't take my shit because you're gonna go to hell because God said so. And it's kind of up to the Earl whether they actually believe that or not, etc. So I did like a side-by-side comparison here of like what might be considered like equivalent across these power hierarchies, and why, like, for example, you'll get weird things on like land use rights and who can conduct commerce where and things like this. And later, I think in the book, we'll actually see like there's this very really interesting distinction that's drawn in three categories. It's basically law, power, and morality. And these are not always in sync with each other. And so, two examples down here at the bottom of this, right? There's an example called the Battle of the Cows, where basically there were a bunch of monks in Normandy who had their pasture rights to cattle, whereas the count or the earl took his knights, right? The knights served the earl or the count, and basically took and sleazed and slaughtered the cows. And then basically the monks excommunicated the knights. And so it's basically like a very simple clash. And I've listed like the primary literature here that showed this sort of standoff, right? And so monks aren't like innocent people who are just praying to God all the time, right? They are landowners. They care about their land rights. They care about defending them, and they will stand up against secular hierarchies. And oftentimes they'll get killed because of it. And that's where the idea of martyrdom comes from. The second example, which is called the investiture controversy, this is what Sirius was talking about, where basically, who gets to appoint bishops, right? The king or the pope. And so, Henry wanted to appoint his own bishop, whereas Archbishop of Canterbury said, no, like, we have the right to do that. And so Henry banned the archbishop from England. And they originally reached a compromise. The church would elect bishops, but the king could approve them and receive their homage. And so, like, technically the church has moral authority, but you can see the king is trying to extract like economic provisions. And I included this funny thing because it's like, what does the homage actually look like? Like, what were they fighting over? And the vassal kneels and places his palms together as if praying. The Lord places his hands over the hand of the vassal. So this might be the king or the archbishop to the bishop. And the vassal declares belonging to the Lord. Sometimes they then kiss each other on the mouth to symbolize friendship. So it's not gay if you're a bishop and you're getting ordained. Hashtag. It's okay. Kissing is not gay, apparently. So that just like made me laugh aloud when I read that, because it's like you're literally fighting over what is the correct procedure for homage for a bishop to get anointed, and it's like it's like, no, he has to kiss me, no, he has to kiss me. And so here are the primary sources, and I think the big thing here, right, is that it shows like the precarious position that both bishops and archbishops are in, where they basically have to like often play both sides, where they keep the king pacified, but they also keep the church and its rituals pacified, right? And I think this is a theme that's going to come up a lot, is like, as a bishop, like you'll see situations in which like they almost structurally are required to play this double agent role. And so that's just kind of the water that everybody is swimming in. That's my presentation. I'm going to shut up for a bit and put my dish in the sink. You guys talk for a bit. I'll be back in like 2-3 minutes.
I guess real quick, just a funny tangent real quick on Anselm is because he was banished, I believe his symbol, his emblem is that of like a ship on waves, because he had to travel for his banishment in this controversy. And is anyone else familiar with sort of the Latin cross style that they typically would use for churches at this time? I had to do some research, because he's mentioning the nave and the transept and all of this.
I'm not familiar, but is it basically just a crosshairs? It's not like a tall, long piece down the center and then a shorter at the mid top, like what we usually see now for a cross?
Can you throw a pickup?
There's a clavicular cross. Is that what you mean, Theon? Which is the double cross, which is now also I think it's mostly used in Brazil. and Argentina, which has actually got, because the Bible, they didn't really know with the Bible what to do with the angels or the saints. It confused them how to put that in. So those things pop up in grimoires and history magically, which I'm quite into, separately from history. It's like an alternate history that's quite interesting. So these different crosses popped up from kind of heretical sources, but also because everybody was underneath kind of the dominion of the church. They all had to appear as if that they were playing by the church's rules. So there's kind of loads of hidden occult symbolism in different crosses around the globe.
Yeah, that's interesting. To be specific, I was referring to the Latin cross, which I believe most churches, at least in England at this time, would have built their design on. I believe St. Peter's is in that same vein. If I can maybe, can I take over presenting? Let's see. Real quick, just real quick. I put something together that we can maybe develop into something more in the future. But let's see.
It's kind of hilarious to see all the different varieties of crosses, right? Like the Crusaders cross looks so fantastically different than the Latin cross. But go on.
Yeah, they're good.
Yeah, here's
that
just
was
a
when
quick.
I was patriarchal. Yeah.
Holy shit. Papal went
Cool,
wild.
That'd be cool. There's a lot I can talk about here as well in terms of the symbolism, but that's for another time. But yeah, it's isn't it?
Bro, that papal cross is wild.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
cool.
Also, that Maltese looks like a weapon, like a starburst that you throw at someone to shank them.
Yeah.
The St Andrew's cross is interesting. There's also a Celtic, which is sort of, I mean, obviously it's a similar shape to